When Charlie Kirk was fatally shot on a Utah college campus in September, I heard his death being compared to that of a man I had never heard of, Horst Wessel. Now, maybe that makes me a bit less educated about the history of the Second World War than I thought, but I'm gonna guess I wasn't alone there. That's because Horst Wessel mattered deeply to those who believed in the National Socialist Party, but is pretty well wiped off the German and world map today. When Wessel's name came up after Kirk's death, I needed to understand why. And look, I want to be clear here. I'm not likening the men as some folks did online. That's not my comparison to make. But when a Nazi martyr's name starts popping up in connection with modern political violence, that's exactly the kind of rabbit hole I dive down. I don't like not knowing things, especially when the thing I don't know involves one of history's darkest chapters. So that's why writer Amy Wilson and I decided that we wanted to understand who this guy was and why his story matters now. Now, if you were like us, you might have looked up Wessel after Kirk's death, and if so, one of the very first things you likely encountered was a song. Very soon after his death, the lyrics he wrote for a patriotic, soul-stirring song about being ready to fight for the fatherland became required playlist fodder for any Nazi party gathering, any march, any propaganda film, and soon enough, any German classroom or schoolyard. And any time the party needed a communal boost in spirits or an adrenaline high to go into action. The title of the song, known in the original German as Horst Wessel Lied, is translated simply as the Horst Wessel Song. Infamous Nazi filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl employed it to open her most influential and rousing adulatory tribute to the rise of Adolf Hitler, Triumph of the Will. And it wasn't just ceremonial. On Kristallnacht, the November 1938 pogrom against Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues, Nazi paramilitary forces and Hitler Youth sang this song as they prepared to amp up their violence. Now, before we go any further, I need to give you some important context. The Horst Wessel song has been banned in Germany and Austria since 1945, except for educational and scholarly purposes. We're including a brief historical excerpt here, less than 30 seconds, specifically for educational purposes, to help you understand how extremist movements use music for indoctrination and propaganda. What you're about to hear is Joseph Goebbels, the future Reich Minister of Propaganda for the Nazis, speaking at Wessel's 1930 funeral, followed by a brief excerpt of the song that was named in honor of its dead lyricist. The 15 years between Horst Wessel's death and the end of World War II marked an era where his name was revered, compared to Christ, and memorialized in great and grand gestures. Naturally, I had questions. First, who was Horst Wessel and who killed him and why? How did one dead stormtrooper become Nazi Germany's ultimate martyr? Why is he known to neo-Nazis, but is a shadow figure at best to the rest of us? And lastly, why can't his namesake tune, once on the tongue of every German, be sung legally in that country today? This is Crimes of the Centuries. I'm your host, Amber Hunt. In Daniel Siemens' definitive book, The Making of a Nazi Hero, The Murder and Myth of Horst Wessel, the author opens with the story of how the head of the American school in Berlin, a man named Gregor Ziemer, traveled around the country in the late 1930s to see how German education was changing with the Nazis now in charge. Siemens, professor and chair of European history at Newcastle University, Newcastle-on-Tyne, relates how one night Ziemer watched as 30 girls, all members of something called the League of German Girls, quote, danced in a circle and sang, their moonlit hands imploringly raised to the sky, end quote. When Zimmer asked what the occasion was, the girls said it was national hero Horst Wessel's birthday. But that wasn't all. Seymour found out that, quote, their dance was meant to invoke the party saint and likewise served as a fertility ritual. The spirit of Wessel was to help them become good mothers, end quote. All in service to Germany. It should be noted that the lyrics to the song are directed mainly at young German males who will soon be called to arms to press their ideas on the nation. In essence, Horst Wessel existed, at least in the early 1930s, to marshal a movement that was preparing young Germans to die, if that's what Nazi leadership demanded of them. Even then, Nazi leadership meant Adolf Hitler. And make no mistake, he was going to demand. Horst Wessel was the firstborn son of Ludwig and Marguerite Wessel of Bielefeld, Westphalia, a linen manufacturing town in the western part of Germany. Ludwig was rigid and forbearing, a Lutheran pastor who had no compunction about letting his feelings be known about the superiority of the Aryan race and the despicability of anyone who did not believe as he did. He had a particular antipathy toward those who were Jewish. Marguerite came from a family of Lutheran pastors. The family moved to Berlin when Horst was still young and lived on Hudenstrasse. That translates to Street of the Jews, one of the oldest thoroughfares in the city. They were solidly middle class, staunchly conservative, and leaned into a kind of radical Christianity that saw Jesus as an Aryan fighter. As Horst grew up, he was more interested in politics than school, being a so-so student, but a young man in a hurry to be seen and, more than that, heard. His ideas, which came from his father, did not change as he grew into manhood. Here's Daniel Siemens, author of The Making of a Nazi Hero.
All his life, from the time he was politicized as a young teenager, he always was in the same circle of right-wing ideology, and he has never fully, there's at least no sign that he had any kind of intellectual engagement and maybe cultural background that might have empowered him to take a critical stance once the Nazis came to power.
Siemens makes it clear that before his death, Wessel was not much known outside of a small district in Berlin, where he regularly made speeches and stumped for the new National Socialists. But he did stand out there. This was a time when Germany was struggling mightily to climb out of the despair, economic chaos, and shame of World War I. All kinds of ideas were on the table for how to proceed. The rivals for an anti-democratic choice were the Communist Workers' Party, the KDP, and the National Socialists, the NSDAP. Not to belabor this, but the KDP were Marxists who saw a global revolution on the part of the universal working class. The NSDAP put Germany first, assuming always that Aryans were racially, culturally, and morally superior to its enemies. And everyone was its enemy. Horst's preferred version of National Socialism leaned hard on the socialism part, where the working man, his rights and needs took precedence, which does not mean he wasn't also devoted to the nationalism part of the National Socialism that required support for Germany's interests to the exclusion of the interests of other nations. That description makes Nazism sound like something that wouldn't have ruffled the communist leaners too much, but it did. And not for the obvious reasons. Here's Vejas Lilevicius, a professor of modern German history at the University of Tennessee, speaking to Lex Friedman, a scientist and podcaster.
For their part, the communists, and from the perspective of the Soviet Union, the Nazis were in essence a super capitalist conspiracy. If the cosmological enemy are the capitalists and the owners, the exploiters, then all of the rigmarole about race and nationalism are distractions. They're meant to fool the poor saps who enlist in that movement. It's essentially steered by capitalist owners who, it is claimed, are reduced to this desperate expedient of coming up with this thuggish party that represents the last gasp of capitalism.
Such disagreement bred great discontent. It was not uncommon for Berliners to witness young men violently brawling over which direction the German nation should move. The young Wessel chose to do propaganda and organizational work for the nascent Nazi movement. It's unclear how much actual street brawling he engaged in, but given that such interactions usually involved groups of men rather than single one-on-one encounters, he could have easily tagged along and bruised his knuckles. He was like most of his generation in the late 1920s, unemployed, though there are indications he may have driven a taxi or done some construction work now and then. It's likely that after his father died in 1922, his mother sent him money to live on. In late 1926, when he was 18, he joined the SA, a Nazi paramilitary organization, attaining the rank of Sturmführer, or lieutenant. By that time, Adolf Hitler had been the Nazi party boss for 5 years, and his control over the party was already unchallenged. That doesn't mean the party wasn't still evolving, trying to consolidate its various factions into a unifying philosophy. Wessel's sphere of influence was very small, but he happened to live and do his activist best in a district that was also home to Der Angriff, the official newspaper of the Berlin division of the Nazi Party. Its publisher was all in on the aggressive rhetoric of the radical nationalists. His name was Joseph Goebbels. Der Angriff translates in English to attack. Wessel ate up its unrelenting daily serving of grievances and hate. Russell Lemons, the Jacksonville State University professor of history who wrote Goebbels and Der Angriff, explains that some of the most important propaganda motifs that would come to define the Third Reich first appeared in the pages of that newspaper. And because Goebbels had put himself in Berlin, the center of political life in the Weimar Republic in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Der Angriff did more than just report on the blood years of the Reich, but it helped to create and shape them. Wessel was Goebbels' perfect target. He belonged to the war youth generation. That's boys born between 1900 and 1910 who had been too young to fight in World War I, but were old enough to watch their fathers return home defeated. They had seen Germany lose territory, watched the economy collapse, felt the national humiliation. In the late 20s, while Americans drank bathtub gin and frequented jazz clubs, Goebbels was gathering steam and followers, protégés, and puppets. Wessel was going deeper too, becoming the leader of SA Sturm 5 in the working-class Berlin district of Friedrichshain. He spent all of his time giving fervent speeches and writing jingoist poems and crafting songs with meaningful and passionate lyrics about going to war. Wessel and Goebbels met in 1927. Goebbels wrote in his diary sometime that year that Wessel, who was just 20 at the time, was, quote, a fine boy who speaks with incredible idealism, end quote. Sometime in the next year or so, Wessel began writing his autobiography, a treatise on his political philosophy, a prelude for what he believed would be a serious, lifelong Nazi political career. He wrote that the schools he had attended and the paramilitary groups he'd been a part of were simply not politicized enough for his taste, that he had always felt it was past time to march against and vanquish the weak. Wessel would also say that Goebbels had sent him to Vienna to see how their Nazi youth groups were working and to organize Austrian youth to follow their lead. Maybe it was a test, or perhaps an internship, suggests Siemens, for that promising life of a political career. He was always working for the cause, which meant something different then than it does now. Here's Siemens again.
We have to go back to the 1920s and to how politics was done. And one way, a very popular way, were these political songs that you used frequent melodies that everyone knew ideally, and you just had different texts. And by singing together, you created this feeling of togetherness, which you also need for political mobilization, in particular when you ask the people that you want to mobilize to maybe, put their lives or their health at risk. So you need strong bonds. And strong bonds were created by the early Nazi movements by either doing things collectively, including engaging in violent acts, but also by spending spare time together, drinking together, and singing the same songs. And the music side of it, of the whole story, is probably the most effective part of it when it comes to propaganda.
One of those songs would be written by Horst Wessel himself, and it would outlive them all. It's not known exactly when Horst Wessel penned Raise the Flag, the song he wrote for his SA regiment that would soon bear his name. The music wasn't original. It was more like a combo platter, a tasting from familiar German folk songs with new words set to them. Der Angriff published the lyrics sometime in 1929. It may have been first sung on Berlin streets in May of that year by the members of his SA division. This is more or less also around the time that Wessel began living with Erna Jennecke, a woman who had once depended on sex work to sustain herself. It has been heavily debated if she was especially dedicated to her craft or was simply a woman who needed to pay her rent in very hard times. I do not judge. Horst met Erna at Café Mexico, a working man's bar that may have also been a favorite of those who partook in small-time criminality. There will be brief hints later that Wessel was Erna's pimp. His mother and sister would insist the two young people were just friends. Some sources insist they had plans to marry. The truth must be in there somewhere. In any case, Wessel had arranged to lease the third floor of Grosse Frankfurter Straße 62, a tenement building. Wessel lived there with Janneke. Up front, he paid something like 200 Reichsmarks, an amount that was supposed to cover about 6 months. When widowed landlady Frau Elisabeth Salm was forced to return to Berlin or forfeit her home, new rules in the new Germany, she found Erna there and said she had to pay rent too, which she did at the half rate of 16.25 marks a month. Wessel thought that was an outrageous ask, but Erna paid up. Then Frau Salm moved in as well, sleeping in the kitchen because, as Wessel reminded her, he had paid for the whole flat. This sounds a tad trifling, but it will end badly. That's because Frau Salm and Wessel soon fought over everything. How many people he could have in the apartment, how loud they could be, the appropriateness of what they were discussing, how drunk they could get, when the rent was due, when it was paid, and, oh yeah, Erna's career choices. Stressful all around. Then, on December 22nd, 1929, during some kind of Nazi training event hundreds of miles away, a bunch of trainees got lost and froze to death in a snowstorm. Wessel's younger brother, Werner, was among them. Ingeborg, their sister, would later write that Horst had been stupefied by the news and may have briefly considered leaving his political work behind. Maybe it was a serious existential crisis. Maybe it was just momentary grief. But Wessel stayed in Berlin with Erna and continued to fight with Frau Salm. They were fighting so much that, though the year had barely begun, the landlady had had enough. On the night of Tuesday, January 14th, 1930, Frau Salm, whose dead husband had been a Red Front fighter, went to a bar that welcomed communist revolutionaries. She complained loudly about her tenant, saying that his words to her had been threatening. When she finally spoke this guy's name, the previously uninterested bunch perked up. This was a good opportunity, they agreed, to teach the big Nazi talker a lesson. They'd give him what they termed a proletariat drubbing. They were already primed to do something. Just a few hours earlier, National Socialist stormtroopers had critically wounded a young communist in a serious scrap that had taken place very close to where they had all been drinking. Frau Zalm led the rough and possibly drunk crowd to her apartment. Included were brothers Max, Walter, and Willi Jambrowski, as well as Josef Kandulski, Albrecht Hurler, and Erwin Ruckert. It was right at 10 p.m. Horst had been expecting a friend to come to the apartment that night to talk politics. He answered the door. What happened next was never exactly made clear. Still, there is plenty one can take away as fact. Almost immediately, someone standing on the other side of the door decided to shoot. A single 9mm bullet hit Wessel in the face. He fell backward and hit his head on the door of the kitchen stove. The bullet had entered his mouth around the upper jaw, lodging in his cervical vertebrae. It had torn through his tongue, his palate, and tore his carotid artery on the left side. His upper teeth, like his upper palate, were destroyed. This hadn't been the plan. This was supposed to be a good all-purpose thrashing. No one had mentioned murdering him on his doorstep. There was a story told later that Frau Zalm had summoned a nearby friend, a doctor, to see what could be done, but that because the doctor was Jewish, he'd been sent away by Wessel. And this is unlikely, as Wessel couldn't have spoken if he'd wanted to. Maybe, some later suggested, it was Richard Fiedler, the friend that Horst had been expecting, who had shown up and turned the Jewish doctor away. Whatever the case, there appears to have been a delay in calling for help. It has also been suggested that friend Fiedler spent precious minutes clearing the place of incriminating materials before any police or ambulance arrived. The author Siemens found records that show that emergency personnel arrived by 10:15 and that Wessel was in the emergency room of the local hospital by 10:30. For the next 2 hours, he underwent surgery, though his prognosis was very bleak. The communist hooligans retreated to the bar, where portraits of Vladimir Lenin and Friedrich Engels decorated the walls, and immediately began to think about their next step. The shooter had been Albrecht Hurler, who maintained that he had shot Wessel in self-defense, that he knew, because Frau Zalm had told them, that Wessel owned guns and believed he'd seen the man reach into his pocket to arm himself. Hurler would argue then, and later, that if it hadn't been self-defense, he would have continued to shoot to be sure Wessel was dead. Because, to be clear, Wessel at this point was not dead, and wouldn't be for quite some time. It's alleged that at the bar, comrade Josef Kandulski told the crew gathered there, "Anyone who squeals gets a bullet in the head." This was a tough bunch. Berlin rocked with the news of the shooting, mostly because while street fights and public brawls were commonplace, it was a gross acceleration of violence for attacks to take place in people's homes. Call it an unwritten rule, but rivals had lived literally side by side during these blood years and rarely broached it. But Horst Wessel had been shot down where he was supposed to be safe. Berlin's papers picked their battlegrounds. The establishment press played it down the middle, just the facts. The communist rags went on the defensive, desperately recasting their gunman as a jilted lover and Wessel as a common pimp. Neither side understood what had really just happened. But Goebbels did. He saw exactly what this could become. He wrote that it had been a communist assassination attempt on, quote, Berlin's most active Sturmführer, end quote. Egregious. Catastrophic. Truth was, the shooting of Wessel was only a catastrophe for the communists, said Siemens. It pushed them to go underground and change the rules of the political game they had all been relatively safe abiding by. Wessel's death was a step too far. While the young man still drew breath in the hospital, Goebbels visited him several times, though, again, it was unlikely much was said, at least by Wessel, for whom doctors had little hope. He mercifully died on February 23rd, more than a month after the shooting. He was 22 years old. In Goebbels' diary, the future propaganda leader of the Third Reich, was already hatching plans to make the unfortunate stormtrooper's murder akin to a crucifixion. He wrote that the young idealist, now perished, was, quote, a new martyr for the new Reich, end quote. He took charge of funeral arrangements. He reached out to Hitler, who declined the invitation to attend Wessel's March 1st funeral. Disappointed, Goebbels was, however, undeterred in making Wessel's farewell into a showpiece of conspicuous sorrow. He arranged to have it filmed to be used, as necessary, to fire up the troops. He claimed that 30,000 people watched as Wessel was laid to rest in the St. Nicholas Cemetery in Prenzlauer Berg, a locality of Berlin. He would claim as well that the funeral procession had been attacked on its way there, but there are no reports or evidence that such attacks occurred. Wessel's regiment again sang his song to emphasize the sacrifice the young, now dead man had made to his country. In mid-tune, they altered the lyrics to reach out to their friend and sang, quote, sleep well, Sturmfuhrer Wessel, you always did your duty. The SA comrades who survive you will take vengeance on your behalf, end quote. Goebbels clearly saw his idea to use Horst was proving effective. In recent days, there have been suggestions on the internet that a speech made by Goebbels in 1932 was echoed by White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller when he spoke at the funeral of Charlie Kirk. In the 1932 speech, Goebbels referred to, quote, our dead comrade Horst Wessel, end quote, and his lyric, the day of freedom and prosperity is coming. He followed that by saying, quote, we are fulfilling his prophecy, end quote. Miller, in his eulogy for Kirk, promised that, quote, we will achieve victory for our children, for our families, for our civilization, and for every patriot who stands with us, end quote. Goebbels considered that speech, he titled it The Storm is Coming, one of the strongest he ever gave. Miller also used the storm analogy. He spoke, as Goebbels did, of righteous fury. Miller said that the world has no idea what it has awakened in, quote, the army in all of us, end quote. Goebbels spoke as well to an awakening, calling his followers, quote, an army of revenge, end quote. There's more, but you get the point. And this is why Horst Wessel's name comes up now. But his funeral was not the end of Horst Wessel, because Joseph Goebbels knew what Hitler needed, and that was a myth that would help German soldiers and the German people find meaning in the possibility of their own violent deaths. To that end, by April, the Horst Wessel song was heard in every corner of Berlin. Translated from German, the few stanzas of lyrics, which, remember, are banned in Germany and Austria except for educational purposes, are clear in their intent. All of us are ready to fight. Hitler flags soon wave on every street. Our servitude is nearly over. The flag is high, our ranks are closed. The SA marches with silent, solid steps. Comrades shot by the Red Front in reaction march in spirit with us in our ranks. It's no battle hymn of the Republic, but it worked for them. It would take 15 years and more than 85 million deaths to stop the singing. Police investigating Wessel's death rounded up the likely suspects, who maintained that no one had spoken of murder in their efforts to teach Wessel a lesson. Apparently, the prosecutor agreed and, in June of 1930, formally charged Hurler, Ruckert, and Kandulski with jointly committed manslaughter. By the way, this may be one of the last times that the judicial branch would show some real independence from the Nazi Party. The bending of the collective judicial spine took 3 years to complete, but by the time Nazis seized power on January 30th, 1933, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, the party was not to be denied. Within weeks of the appointment, the Reichstag was burned, censorship was universal, and civil liberties had been suspended indefinitely in Germany. But we're still in 1930 when the Horst Wessel manslaughter trial began on September 22nd. It drew a big crowd. Society types and petty criminals mingled, as likely did Nazis and communists. From descriptions in the local papers, things quickly became raucous. So rough was the crowd that women had to be carried over the heads of others, sort of mosh pit style, to avoid being hurt. Throughout the 3-day trial, the defendants had all maintained that the matter that night was a personal rather than a political one. The verdict came at the end of the week on September 26, 1930. Hurler and Rucker got 6 years, 1 month in prison. Kandulski got 5 years, 1 month. Max Jambrowski got 2 years. His brothers Walter and Willy got 1.5 apiece. Frau Zalm, for her part, got the same as Walter and Willy. No one was happy with the verdict. The communist press decried it as too harsh. The Nazi press thought it was a slap in the face and typical of German justice. The mainstream press puzzled over it. No one thought they'd heard the end of it. And they hadn't. In June 1933, another man, Peter Stoll, was arrested. He and his wife had been in some kind of drunken fight in public, and the wife had yelled out so loudly that others heard her words clearly that her husband was going to do to her what he had done to Horst Wessel. She was not crying wolf. Once incarcerated, Stoll started naming names, adding Sally Epstein and Hans Ziegler, 2 communist street fighters, as being part of the gang who had been at the Wessel apartment that night. The 3 men now included had not been part of the original trial, but the Nazi Party was now firmly ensconced and law enforcement more heavily reinforced from within the party's ranks. The investigation continued throughout the summer when the imminent peril for any communist involved in the Wessel case became suddenly clearer. In September, as Albrecht Hurler was being transferred from an interrogation outpost back to his prison cell in Lower Silesia, he was rerouted, intercepted, and led into a forest, where he was given notice that he had been adjudged guilty of the murder of Horst Wessel by the Gestapo and had been sentenced to die. They told him this was as good a time as any to carry out the sentence. His bullet-riddled body was left in the forest. The second trial concerning Wessel's death opened in May 1934. Unlike the first trial, this one presupposed that the men had gone to Wessel's flat to kill him. Despite Willy Jambrowski telling the judge that Ziegler and Epstein weren't involved, the 2 men were both found guilty and sentenced to die. Stoll was given 7.5 years for being an accomplice. Court papers indicate that because he had not joined the communists until October 1929, he hardly knew of Wessel and thus had no great motive to kill him. Plus, he'd been quite accommodating in ratting out his 2 friends, who were summarily beheaded with an axe on April 10, 1935. The opportunity for a third trial in the case came up in 1937 when Bruno Natouche was identified as being on scene as a lookout when Wessel was shot. Taken into custody and questioned, Natouche said he was innocent, though he had been, he agreed, a communist at the time of the murder. Before much else could happen, Natouche hanged himself with his own belt from the window of his cell. It's telling that nearly everyone proven or suspected to be involved in Wessel's death was killed by the Nazis through immediate execution, show trials, or later in the concentration camps with millions of others. And what can only be described as better late than never, the Berlin Public Prosecutor's Office overturned the convictions of Hans Ziegler, Sally Epstein, and Peter Stoll. They did so on February 9th, 2009. It's important to know that when Wessel was murdered, Nazi stalwarts in Berlin numbered less than 500. The tight-knit group mostly knew one another, and most knew Wessel because of the high-profile and public presence he nurtured. It's also important to know that community singing, be it in church, on holidays, at national events, in schools, and in homes, was a much-loved and shared activity. This may have been the moral equivalent of how non-pack crowds now sing Take Me Home Country Road at random international sporting events. But bigger and less milquetoast than John Denver. Joseph Goebbels had gotten very lucky to have himself a martyr who came complete with his own walk-up song. It served as the soundtrack to the rise of Nazism in Germany. At Wessel's funeral, Goebbels told the crowd how he envisioned a reawakened German people, soon to be marching in endless columns. He promised, quote, children in the schools, workers in the factories, and soldiers on the road, end quote, would soon be singing Horst Wessel's song. To speed that along, he released the song on a record that same year. Then began the day-long ceremonies honoring him at his home, the hospital where he died, at his grave site. There were wreath-laying and concerts and patriotic readings and musical performances surrounding all of it. Goebbels had made it so. I found a video of a massive crowd gathered in a street in the collection held at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. The caption reads, quote, a huge crowd gathered on Horst Wessel Platz in Berlin sings folk songs. The narrator says that the event, and others like it, was organized by a Berlin radio station. The camera focuses on a choir of Hitler Youth and League of German Girls members singing. The crowd then whistles the tune. End quote. The cult of Horst Wessel didn't fade. It metastasized. For the next several years, Goebbels orchestrated what can only be described as a full-spectrum propaganda assault. The song, the myth, the martyr, all of it became inescapable. By 1934, the state mandated that Germans give the Hitler salute during the first and fourth verses. It was also taught to very young children and sung often during the school day. The tune became muscle memory for an entire generation. In a video called Third Reich Testimonials Final Account, documentarian Zoltan Kakesi found that elderly Germans could be prompted to remember their experiences in Hitler Youth or the League of German Girls by being asked to sing the Horst Wessel song. Here's a man only identified as Gunther L. He said he joined Hitler Youth despite disapproval from his socialist parents. He's talking to producer Luke Holland in 2012.
Ach so, ja. Zum Beispiel, ein junges Volk steht auf zum Sturm bereit. Reckt die Fahne höher, Kameraden. Mit uns da zieht die neue Zeit, die Zeit der jungen Soldaten. Vor uns marschieren mit sturmzerfetzten Fahnen die toten Helden der jungen Nation. Und über uns die Helden ahnen, Deutschland, Vaterland, wir kommen schon. Beispielsweise, das war also für so, Kinder genommen, was Erhebendes. Das war also schon was und überall hingen ja die Plakate mit der Aufforderung nun...
Sie haben da, glaube ich, ein Exemplar davon. Das hat dieses Farb und vieles. Das wäre nicht uninteressant, das kurz anzuschauen. Ja, genau.
Das zum Beispiel.
Something elevating. That's what he remembers. Not the ideology, not the violence it celebrated, just the feeling it gave him as a child. But for Jewish children, the song meant something else entirely. Frank Cohn, a German-born Jew, told this story at a Jewish Material Claims Against Germany conference.
It was 1932 when I started first grade public school in Breslau, Germany. I don't remember much about my first grade teacher, but in second grade, I had a wonderful young teacher named Herr Schubert. I loved him, and I could tell that he liked me too. When third grade was to start, I heard that Herr Schubert would again be our teacher. I was thrilled and could hardly wait to see him. But when he entered the classroom, he was wearing a full Nazi uniform. I was devastated. And then it started with words. We will start the class with a Nazi Horst Wessel song. Everybody stand up except you, Cohn. You're not allowed to sing that song because you are a Jew. The kid who must sit while the others stand is marked as an undesirable. I immediately lost all my prior school friends. I was chased after school, but as a good runner, I managed to elude them. My parents promptly transferred me to a private Jewish school, but life thereafter was never the same for me in Germany. We managed to escape in 1938, arriving in New York just before Kristallnacht.
The song was more than propaganda. It was a sorting mechanism, a daily ritual that separated us from them. And Wessel's name was everywhere. City streets were renamed in his honor, town squares, military units, a ship, school buildings, and dormitories were rebranded with his name. You couldn't walk through a German city without encountering some monument to this dead stormtrooper. State-run radio played the song constantly. It opened broadcasts, it closed them, it filled the dead air in between programs. Horst Wessel became the soundtrack to the Third Reich. With the ubiquity of the Horst Wessel song, there was bound to be a legal dispute. In the mid-1930s, two publishing houses and Horst's mother and sister were involved in protracted legal disputes over who exactly owned the rights to the song. This was a sticky business because the melody wasn't his and the lyrics were not copyrighted by him, and the Wessel women said their financial interest through the publishing firm's use of his work was their only source of income. The lawsuits ran their course through the German justice system and were about to be heard by the nation's highest court. As with most things Wessel, Joseph Goebbels stepped in to stop anyone or any publisher being given the rights to the song which he had made famous. He arranged for everyone to agree to an out-of-court settlement, which never came to pass. History was intervening. The lawsuits became irrelevant once the song's propaganda value outweighed any commercial concerns. It had woven itself into Nazi life, in charges, schools, state ceremonies. At the memorial held at Wessel's gravesite on the occasion of his first birthday after his death, Goebbels had told the crowd that the young man, quote, had risen in soul and spirit at this very same hour, resurrected in a new generation of German, end quote. That sounded to many as if he was anointing Wessel as the Nazi Christ. When Stephen Miller said in his eulogy for Charlie Kirk that the young man would be immortal, some commentators on social media again recalled Goebbels' own language about Wessel and drew comparisons. As early as 1934, German Protestants were buying that idea. Though they did not embrace Wessel in quite that way, they embraced his sacrifice and his ability to stir a nation, explicitly saying that the Nazi movement had been blessed by God. Churches, most especially the conservative wing of the Lutheran Church, began to align themselves with the principles espoused by Hitler and his party. Theologian Paul Althaus, a professor of theology at the University of Erlangen and the leading authority on the life of Luther, even referred to Hitler in 1933 as a gift and a miracle of God. In something called the German Christian movement, religious leaders now bent over backwards to justify and preach the rightness of the Nazi cause, promoting a racialized version of the Bible. They even went so far as to advocate for the wholesale removal of the Old Testament from it. They claimed the Old Testament was heresy. In response to the Old Testament removal demand, a group called the Pastors' Emergency League formed. Among those who opposed the Nazification of the church were theologians Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller, who helped create the Confessing Church to distance Christianity from Hitler's party. They insisted that God, not Hitler and not his laws, directed the activities of the church. Yet only 20% of German pastors supported the Confessing Church, and chose Christ over the Fuhrer. Johnny Thompson, a former Oxford philosophy professor and now a staff writer for Big Think, made a point to talk about how Bonhoeffer viewed the regime under which he lived. This is from Mini Philosophy Online.
For Bonhoeffer, stupidity is far more concerning than evil. There are evil people in life. There are murderers, cheaters, and liars, but they are not the greatest threat. Because once something is known to be evil, the good of the world can rally to defend and fight against it. When we know somebody is bad, we know how to take a stand. And so, as Bonhoeffer put it, evil always carries within itself the germ of its own subversion. Stupidity, though, is a different problem. A stupid person can be guided, steered, and manipulated to do any number of things, and history teaches us that stupidity does not mean you cannot be powerful. Evil is a puppet master, and it loves nothing so much as a powerful idiot.
Niemöller was arrested July 1st, 1937. Found guilty of treason, he was sentenced to prison, but was instead determined to be Hitler's personal prisoner and sent instead, ultimately, to Dachau. He was liberated by the Allies in 1945. Bonhoeffer was arrested and tried for being part of the plot to assassinate Hitler and for being part of the resistance. He was hanged April 9, 1945, less than a month before the war in Europe was officially over. As an interesting aside, in 1946, Niemöller was the author of these now famous words, which I think you'll find familiar. They came first for the communists, and I did not speak up because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialist, and I did not speak up because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak up because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and by that time, there was no one left to speak out for me." End quote. In talking to Siemens, he makes a point about how, after the war began in earnest and other German families had their own sons martyred for the cause, Wessel's name and his glorification was heard less. By 1945, he was an afterthought at best.
I think Horst Wessel is a peacetime hero, so to say. And when the Second World War begins, and the number of German casualties rises, the stories about street brawls and fights with communists, to many people probably sounds like a distant past. And when there are more casualties in families, then at some point also one individual doesn't really matter so much anymore.
He couldn't be used in the same way as he had been before. Only Wessel's enthusiasm for the cause had lingered, until that too wore thin. Crashing through Germany on their way to Berlin, Red Army troops destroyed his gravestone and most remnants of how Germany had honored him. The Horst Wessel song had one last hurrah. This is the official broadcast over German state radio announcing Adolf Hitler's death, a benediction of sorts for the German people to remember. Immediately following the end of the war, West Germany, East Germany, and Austria banned the singing of his song. It is still forbidden to play it in public. You can, however, book a historical tour of the home where he grew up and the one where he was shot if you're ever in Berlin. The tour covers the working man's life circa 1930 and dabbles a bit in Wessel's murder. According to reporter Nathaniel Flocken, writing in the Berliner magazine in 2024, you can still find the place where Wessel was originally buried, as his father's gravestone next to it was untouched. Flocken writes that, quote, in 1990, after fascism was legalized in East Germany, neo-Nazis began making pilgrimages to the site, end quote. In 2000, a group calling themselves Autonomous Gravediggers said they had dug up Wessel's skull and tossed it into the Spree River. Berlin police at the time said no remains had been stolen. In 2013, Horst and his father's graves were dug up and their bones removed to an undisclosed location by cemetery administrators. Some thought that would be the last we heard from Horst. Apparently not.